When Eleanor Whitfield stepped off that dusty stagecoach in Ember Ridge, Wyoming, she thought she'd seen the worst life could throw at a woman. She was wrong. The man waiting for her, all 7 feet and 3 inches of him, cast a shadow so long it swallowed her whole. "You're too small," Josiah McCready's voice rumbled, like distant thunder, his massive frame blocking out the sun. "But I'll make it fit." The townspeople gathered, whispering, betting on how long this impossible match would last. Some said a week, others gave it 3 days. But they didn't know Eleanor Whitfield, and they sure didn't know the gentle giant who'd just claimed her as his bride. Welcome to a story that defied every odd, challenged every whisper, and proved that love doesn't measure itself in inches or pounds. Stay with me until the very end. You won't believe how this impossible love story unfolds. And don't forget to comment below and tell me what city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this tale of courage and devotion travels across the world. Part 1. The autumn wind of 1887 carried more than just the scent of dying leaves through the streets of Ember Ridge, Wyoming. It carried whispers, speculation, and the kind of anticipation that made a small town hold its collective breath. Every soul within 50 miles knew what was arriving on the 3:15 stagecoach, that Tuesday afternoon, Josiah McCready's mail-order bride. Eleanor Whitfield pressed her gloved hands against the leather seat as the stagecoach lurched over another pothole, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. 22 years old and weighing barely 95 pounds soaking wet, she'd never felt smaller than she did in this moment. The advertisement she'd answered 3 months ago seemed like a lifetime away, now written in careful script by a man who'd described himself simply as a rancher in need of a good woman and companion. What he hadn't mentioned was that he was a legend. The other passengers, a traveling salesman and an elderly widow, had spent the last hour regaling her with tales of Josiah McCready, how he could lift a full-grown bull with his bare hands, how he'd single-handedly built his ranch house in a month, each beam and board placed by his own massive mitts, how children ran to their mothers when his shadow fell across Main Street. 7 feet if he's an inch, the salesman had said, shaking his head. Built like a mountain with legs. Good man, mind you, but... He'd trailed off, glancing at Eleanor's diminutive frame with poorly concealed doubt. Eleanor had kept her expression serene, but inside terror and determination warred for control of her soul. She'd fled Boston with nothing but the clothes on her back and the last of her mother's jewelry sewn into the lining of her coat. Behind her lay a stepfather whose hands wandered where they shouldn't, and a future that held nothing but servitude and shame. Ahead lay the unknown, but it had to be better than what she'd left behind. It had to be. The stagecoach began to slow, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Through the dust-covered window she could see the buildings of Ember Ridge taking shape, a general store, a saloon, a church, with a white steeple that reached toward the endless Wyoming sky. And there, gathered like vultures around a carcass, stood what seemed like half the town's population. "This is it, miss," the driver called down. "Ember Ridge." Eleanor smoothed her navy traveling dress and checked that her hat was secure. Her reflection in the small mirror she pulled from her reticule showed a pale face with large brown eyes that seemed too big for her delicate features. She looked like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes, which, in many ways, she was. The stagecoach shuddered to a halt, and the driver appeared at the door, offering his hand to help her down. Eleanor took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to whatever deity might be listening, and stepped into her new life. The first thing she noticed was the silence. 30 odd people had gathered to witness this moment, but you could have heard a pin drop on the wooden sidewalk. All eyes were fixed on something behind her, something that cast a shadow so vast it seemed to swallow the afternoon sun. Eleanor turned, and her world tilted on its axis. Josiah McCready wasn't just tall, he was a force of nature. Standing nearly 7.5 feet in his worn leather boots, with shoulders that could span a doorway and hands that could palm her head, Like a child's ball, he was everything the stories had promised, and more. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, touching the collar of his flannel shirt, and his beard was neatly trimmed around a face that might have been carved from granite. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, deep green like the heart of a forest and filled with something she hadn't expected: kindness. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. Eleanor had to crane her neck back to meet his gaze, and she was suddenly acutely aware of how she must look to him, a sparrow facing an eagle, a minnow confronting a whale. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the nervous clearing of throats from their audience. "Miss Eleanor Whitfield." His voice was deep as a mountain canyon, gentle as summer rain. When she nodded, unable to find her voice, something that might have been relief flickered across his features. "I'm Josiah McCready. Welcome to Ember Ridge." He removed his hat, revealing hair that caught the afternoon light, and executed a bow that would have been at home in a Boston drawing room. The gesture was so unexpected, so courtly, from such a massive man, that Eleanor felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Mr. McCready?" She managed a curtsy, though she had to tip her head back so far to maintain eye contact that her hat nearly tumbled off. It's a pleasure to meet you." A snort of laughter came from somewhere in the crowd, quickly hushed. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but Josiah's expression darkened like a storm cloud. He turned toward the sound, and the offender, whoever it was, seemed to shrink into the crowd. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, turning back to her. His voice held no censure, just a statement of fact that somehow made Eleanor feel even more inadequate. "But that's all right, we'll make it work." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Eleanor wasn't ready to examine. She was saved from having to respond by the arrival of a woman who appeared to be around 60, with steel gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense expression that suggested she'd been running things long before anyone thought to ask her opinion. "For heaven's sake, Josiah, the poor girl looks ready to faint," the woman said briskly, elbowing her way through the crowd with the efficiency of a small but determined locomotive. "And all of you should be ashamed of yourselves, gawking like she's some kind of circus attraction." She shot a withering look at the assembled townspeople, who began to disperse with the guilty shuffle of children caught with their hands in the cookie jar. "Mrs. Henderson," Josiah said, and Eleanor could hear both affection and gratitude in his voice. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Miss Eleanor Whitfield. Eleanor, this is Mrs. Henderson. She runs the general store and most everything else in this town. Now don't you go exaggerating, Mrs." Henderson said, but Eleanor could see she was pleased. The older woman turned to study Eleanor with sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything from the quality of her gloves to the careful mending on her sleeve. Whatever she saw must have passed muster, because her expression softened. "Welcome to Ember Ridge, dear. I expect you're tired from your journey." "A bit," Eleanor admitted, surprised by the kindness in the woman's voice. After the stares and whispers, it was like a cool drink of water in the desert. "Well, then we'd better get you settled." Mrs. Henderson turned to Josiah. "The ceremony, now, if Eleanor's agreeable." Josiah's eyes found hers again, and Eleanor was struck by the uncertainty she saw there. For all his size and strength, he seemed as nervous as she was. "That is, if you haven't changed your mind." The question hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. Eleanor thought of Boston, of her stepfather's leering smile and grasping hands, of the future that awaited her there. Then she looked at this gentle giant who bowed like a gentleman and asked permission instead of demanding compliance. "I haven't changed my mind," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Something that might have been relief flickered across Josiah's features. "Then we'd better head to the church. Reverend Williams is waiting." The walk to the church was a study in contrasts. Josiah's massive strides could have covered the distance in a dozen steps, but he shortened his pace to match Eleanor's, his boots echoing against the wooden sidewalk like distant thunder. She had to take 2 steps for every one of his, and even then, she felt like a child struggling to keep up with a parent. The church was small but well maintained, with white painted walls and windows that caught the afternoon light. Reverend Williams waited at the altar, a thin man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, who seemed utterly unfazed by the unusual couple approaching him. "Josiah," he said warmly, then turned to Eleanor with a smile. "And this must be Miss Whitfield. Welcome, my dear." "Thank you, Reverend." Eleanor managed, acutely aware of how her voice echoed in the empty church. Mrs. Henderson had followed them in along with her husband, a man whose obvious affection for his wife suggested he'd learned long ago that resistance was futile. "Well then," Reverend Williams said, opening his prayer book, "shall we begin?" What followed was perhaps the strangest wedding ceremony in Ember Ridge's history. Eleanor stood beside Josiah like a child next to her father, having to crane her neck back to see his face. When it came time to exchange rings, his fingers were so large that the simple gold band she'd purchased in Denver looked like a child's toy in his palm. Her own ring, hastily resized by the local blacksmith, slid easily onto her finger, loose enough that she had to curl her hand to keep it from falling off. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Williams said finally, and Eleanor's heart stuttered to a stop. Josiah looked down at her, and she could see her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. The mechanics of such a thing seemed impossible. He would have to practically fold himself in half or lift her off her feet entirely. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the silence stretching until it became almost comical. Then Josiah solved the problem with characteristic directness. His massive hands settled on her waist, spanning nearly from hip to hip, and he lifted her as easily as a man might lift a kitten. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to his shoulders for balance, and suddenly they were eye to eye, her feet dangling a foot off the ground. "Is this all right?" he asked quietly, his voice so low that only she could hear it. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. This close, she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. When his lips touched hers, it was with a gentleness that belied his size, soft, careful over almost before it began. "Mrs. McCready," he said when they separated, and something warm unfurled in Eleanor's chest at the sound of her new name. "Mr. McCready," she whispered back, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed his stern features entirely. The ride to the ranch passed in relative silence. Eleanor, perched on the seat of a wagon that seemed built for someone twice her size, beside a man who could have probably carried both her and the wagon without breaking a sweat. The landscape rolled past endless prairie dotted with cattle and the occasional stand of cottonwoods, all of it dwarfed by mountains that rose like purple giants against the horizon. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said finally, because the silence was becoming oppressive, and because it was true. After the grimy streets and cramped tenements of Boston, this vast openness was like breathing for the first time. "It can be lonely," Josiah said, his eyes fixed on the horse's ears, "especially in winter. The nearest neighbor is once miles off, and the town's 8 miles by the road. I'm not afraid of lonely," Eleanor said, and realized it was true. She'd been alone in a crowd for most of her life. This kind of solitude seemed almost peaceful by comparison. Josiah glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "We'll see." The ranch house appeared as they crested a low hill, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. It was larger than she'd expected, built of hewn logs, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the windows glowed with warm yellow light that promised shelter and warmth. It looked like something from a dream, the kind of home she'd imagined as a child, but never dared hope she might actually have. "You built this?" she asked, unable to keep the awe from her voice. "Most of it." There was quiet pride in Josiah's voice, the satisfaction of a man who'd created something with his own hands. "Took the better part of 2 years. There's still work to be done. The barn needs a new roof, and I'd like to add on to the house eventually, but it's sound." As they drew closer, Eleanor began to notice the details that spoke of a man who'd been preparing for a bride. Flower boxes under the windows, though they were empty now with winter coming. A rocking chair on the porch that looked sized for someone much smaller than Josiah. Steps leading up to the front door that seemed lower than they needed to be for a man of his height. "Did you?" she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the question. "Build it with you in mind." Josiah's voice was carefully neutral. "Some of it. I've been hoping for a wife for a long time, Eleanor. I wanted to make sure the house would be comfortable for someone who wasn't built like me." The simple admission made Eleanor's throat tight. This man, this gentle giant, had spent months, maybe years, planning for a woman he'd never met, making his home welcoming for someone whose only description had been a photograph and a few letters. It was both touching and terrifying, this evidence of how much he'd invested in their marriage before she'd even arrived. Josiah helped her down from the wagon with the same care he'd shown at the church, his hands settling on her waist as he lifted her to the ground. But this time he didn't immediately release her. For a moment they stood there in the gathering dusk, her hands on his forearms, his fingers spanning her tiny waist, both of them struggling with the enormity of what they'd just done. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice rough, "I want you to know. I don't expect I know this is all very sudden, and if you need time—" He was trying to tell her that he wouldn't force himself on her. Eleanor realized that despite being her husband, despite having every legal right to demand her compliance, he was offering her a choice. The knowledge made her eyes burn with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the relief and gratitude flooding through her. He nodded, seeming to understand what she couldn't say, and released her. "Come on then, let's get you inside before you freeze." The interior of the house was as thoughtfully planned as the exterior. The main room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books. The furniture was clearly handmade, crafted with the kind of care that spoke of long winter evenings, and a man who understood the value of beauty as well as function. But it was the details that made Eleanor's breath catch. A step stool placed strategically beside the kitchen counter. Hooks for coats and hats mounted at a height she could actually reach. A small, delicate rocking chair positioned near the fire that looked like it had been built specifically for someone her size. "You made all of this?" she asked, running her fingers along the smooth arm of the rocking chair. "Had to make the furniture anyway," Josiah said, but she could hear the embarrassment in his voice. "Store-bought things don't fit me too well. Figured they might not fit you either, just in the other direction." Eleanor sank into the rocking chair, surprised by how perfectly it fit her small frame. From here, she could see the entire main room, the kitchen with its massive stove and carefully organized shelves, the dining table with 4 chairs, too large, too small, the stairs leading to what she assumed was the bedroom. Everything spoke of planning, of hope, of a man who'd spent months imagining a life shared with someone else. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. Josiah's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll show you the rest tomorrow. You must be tired from traveling." As if summoned by his words, exhaustion hit Eleanor like a physical weight. The long journey, the wedding, the sheer emotional upheaval of the day, it all crashed down on her at once, leaving her feeling hollow and overwhelmed. "The bedroom is upstairs," Josiah continued, his voice carefully neutral. I've set up a place for myself in the barn for now, until you're comfortable with the arrangement." Eleanor looked up at him, this massive, gentle man who was offering her more consideration than any man in her life ever had, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found something she'd never dared dream of. A true home. "Thank you," she whispered again, and this time the words seemed to carry more weight. As Josiah showed her to the bedroom, a cozy space with a bed that looked normal-sized only because everything else in the house was built to his massive scale, Eleanor began to realize that her new life would be nothing like what she'd expected. This wasn't the arrangement of convenience she'd imagined, the practical partnership between strangers that so many mail-order marriages became. This was something far more complicated, far more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. This was the beginning of learning what it meant to be loved by a giant. And as she lay in the darkness that first night, listening to the wind whisper across the prairie and thinking of the man who'd given up his own bedroom, for her comfort, Eleanor Whitfield McCready began to understand that some things, the most important things, couldn't be measured in inches or pounds. They could only be measured in the depth of a man's character and the size of his heart. The first rays of dawn filtered through the lace curtains Eleanor had discovered hanging in the bedroom window, and for a moment she forgot where she was. The bed was too comfortable, the room too quiet, the air too clean and sweet with the scent of pine and wood smoke. Then memory crashed back, the wedding, the giant of a man who was now her husband, the impossible situation she'd willingly walked into. Eleanor rose and dressed quickly, her fingers trembling slightly as she pinned up her hair. Through the window she could see Josiah moving around the barn, his massive frame silhouetted against the pale morning sky. Even at this distance his size was shocking, a reminder of just how far she was from everything familiar and safe. The stairs creaked softly under her feet as she made her way down to the main room. Someone, Josiah obviously, had already stoked the fire and set coffee to brewing on the stove. The thoughtfulness of it made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The front door opened just as she reached the bottom of the stairs, and Josiah ducked through the doorway, his hair damp with morning dew and his shirt streaked with what looked like flour. "You're up early," he said, pulling off his hat. "I thought you might sleep longer after yesterday." "I'm not much for sleeping late," Eleanor replied, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. Were you baking?" A flush crept up Josiah's neck, visible even beneath his beard. "Trying to make biscuits, not having much luck with it. I'm better with cattle than I am with cooking." He gestured toward the kitchen with obvious frustration. "There's coffee, though. That I can manage." Eleanor moved toward the stove, acutely aware of how he stepped aside to give her room, how carefully he moved to avoid overwhelming the space with his presence. The coffee was strong and black steam rising from the pot like incense in a church. "I could help," she offered quietly. "With the biscuits, I mean, if you'd like." Something that might have been relief flickered across Josiah's features. "Would you? I've been trying to figure out the right proportions for weeks now, but everything I make comes out hard as rocks or flat as pancakes." Working in the kitchen together was an exercise in careful choreography. Eleanor quickly discovered that everything had been built. With her in mind, the counters were lower than standard, the cabinets positioned so she could reach them without a step stool. But Josiah still dominated the space, his presence filling every corner like water in a vessel. "The secret is not to overwork the dough," Eleanor explained, her hands moving efficiently as she mixed flour and lard and buttermilk. "And the oven needs to be hot enough that you can't hold your hand inside for more than 3 seconds. Josiah watched her work with the intensity of a man studying scripture, his green eyes tracking every movement of her hands. "You're good at this," he said after a while. "My mother taught me," Eleanor replied, then immediately wished she hadn't. She didn't want to talk about her mother or the life she'd left behind or the reason she'd had to leave it. But Josiah seemed to understand her reluctance. Instead of pressing for details, he simply nodded and said, "She taught you well." The biscuits came out golden and perfect, filling the kitchen with the kind of warm, yeasty smell that made a house feel like a home. They ate in comfortable silence, Eleanor seated in her perfectly sized chair, while Josiah folded his massive frame into his own seat across from her. The table was round, she noticed, probably to make conversation easier when you were dealing with such a difference in height. "Eleanor," Josiah said, finally setting down his coffee cup with careful precision, "I want you to know that you don't have to, that is, if you want to write to your family, or if you've changed your mind about any of this." "I don't have family," Eleanor said quickly, then immediately regretted the sharp edge in her voice. "Not anymore. There's no one to write to." Josiah studied her face with those two perceptive green eyes. "What about friends? Surely there's someone who'll worry if they don't hear from you." Eleanor shook her head, surprised by how much the admission stung. "I didn't have many friends in Boston, and the ones I did have, well, they wouldn't understand this." She gestured vaguely around the kitchen, encompassing the house, the situation, the enormous man sitting across from her. This marrying a stranger, moving to the middle of nowhere, becoming a rancher's wife when I've never been west of Pennsylvania before last week. Eleanor's laugh came out slightly bitter. "They'd think I'd lost my mind." "Have you," Josiah asked quietly, "lost your mind?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Eleanor considered it seriously, thinking of the life she'd left behind. The cramped boarding house, the endless stream of mindless work, the constant fear of her stepfather's visits. Then she looked around this warm, welcoming kitchen, at the man who'd built furniture to fit her tiny frame and given up his own bedroom for her comfort. "No," she said finally, "I don't think I have." Josiah's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Good, because I was starting to worry that one of us might be crazy, and I was hoping it wasn't me." The joke startled a laugh out of Eleanor. A real laugh, the first she'd managed since stepping off the stagecoach. The sound seemed to surprise them both, hanging in the air, like the first notes of a song neither of them had heard before. After breakfast, Josiah offered to show her around the ranch. Eleanor wrapped herself in her warmest cloak and followed him outside, immediately gasping as the Wyoming wind hit her like a physical blow. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the promise of winter and the vast emptiness of the prairie. "It takes some getting used to," Josiah said, noticing her reaction. "The altitude, the wind. Boston's at sea level, isn't it?" Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, rolling grassland dotted with cattle mountains rising like sleeping giants in the distance, sky so vast and blue it made her dizzy. It was beautiful and terrifying and utterly alien, nothing like the crowded streets and sooty buildings she'd known all her life. The barn was a massive structure built to accommodate both Josiah's height and the practical needs of a working ranch. Inside, Eleanor was introduced to a collection of horses that seemed almost as oversized as their owner, enormous draft animals with feet like dinner plates and gentle, curious eyes. "This is Thunder," Josiah said, stroking the neck of a black gelding that stood nearly 18 hands high. "And that's Lightning." He gestured toward a slightly smaller bay mare. "I know the names aren't very original, but they were here when I bought the place." "They're beautiful," Eleanor said, though she kept a careful distance. The horses were larger than any she'd ever seen, their very size a reminder of how out of place she was in this world of giants. "Do you ride?" Josiah asked. "A little. My mother's brother had a small farm outside Boston, and he taught me when I was young, but nothing like—" She gestured helplessly toward the massive animals. "I could teach you," Josiah offered. "If you'd like. There's a smaller mare in the back paddock that might suit you better." The offer was made casually, but Eleanor could hear the hope underlying it. This was important to him. She realized the idea of sharing this part of his world with her. The knowledge made her chest tight with an emotion she didn't want to examine too closely. "I'd like that," she said, and was rewarded with another of those transformative smiles. They spent the morning touring the ranch, Josiah explaining the workings of cattle ranching with the patience of a natural teacher. Eleanor tried to absorb it all, the seasonal rhythms of moving cattle between pastures, The careful breeding programs, the constant battle against weather and predators, and the 100 other challenges that could make or break a rancher in a single season. But mostly she found herself watching Josiah. Here, in his element, he moved with a confidence and grace that seemed impossible for someone his size. He knew every animal by name, could assess the health of a steer. With a single glance, spoke of the land with the kind of deep affection usually reserved for family. "You love it here," she said finally, as they stood on a small rise overlooking the main pasture. "It's all I've ever wanted," Josiah replied simply. "A place of my own, something I could build with my hands. But it's—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "It's lonely work ranching. A man can go weeks without seeing another soul, especially in winter." Eleanor heard the loneliness in his voice, the admission of a man who'd spent too many evenings talking to cattle because there was no one else to listen. It explained the advertisement in the matrimonial paper, the careful preparations he'd made for a wife he'd never met. Josiah McCready hadn't been looking for just any woman, he'd been looking for a partner, someone to share the burden and the beauty of this vast, demanding place. "Is that why you sent for a wife?" she asked quietly. "Because of the loneliness." Josiah was quiet for so long that Eleanor wondered if she'd overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, partly, but not just that. He turned to look at her, his green eyes serious. "I want a family, Eleanor, children to carry on what I'm building here, a woman to share it with, to make it mean something more than just work and survival." He paused, then added with devastating honesty, "I want someone to come home to at the end of the day." The simple admission hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She'd expected practical considerations, a need for someone to cook and clean and manage the household. She hadn't expected this raw vulnerability, this glimpse into the heart of a man who'd built something beautiful and discovered it was meaningless without someone to share it with. "And you think I can be that person?" she asked, the question coming out smaller than she'd intended. "I hope so," Josiah said simply. "I know we're strangers, and I know this situation isn't what either of us probably imagined when we were young and dreaming about marriage, but I hope we might build something good together, something real." Eleanor looked out over the vast expanse of prairie at the cattle dotting the grassland, like scattered thoughts at the mountains rising in the distance, like promises or threats depending on your perspective. It was all so overwhelming, so different from anything she'd ever known. But there was something in Josiah's voice, in the careful hope he was offering, that made her want to try. "I'd like that," she said finally, and meant it. The walk back to the house was different, somehow charged with the weight of possibilities and promises half made. Eleanor found herself noticing details she'd missed before, the way Josiah automatically shortened his stride to match hers, how he positioned himself to shield her from the worst of the wind, the careful consideration in every gesture and word. They were halfway to the house when they heard the sound of approaching horses. Josiah's expression immediately shifted, becoming alert and wary, in a way that made Eleanor's stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "Expecting company?" she asked. "No," Josiah said grimly, "and most folks around here know better than to just drop by unannounced." And 3 riders crested the hill that bordered the eastern edge of the ranch, their horses moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than casual visiting. As they drew closer, Eleanor could make out 2 women and a man, all dressed in the kind of finery that marked them as townspeople rather than ranchers. "Mrs. Pritchard," Josiah muttered under his breath, and Eleanor heard resignation and distaste in equal measure. This should be interesting. The riders approached with the confidence of people who considered themselves important, their horses prancing and snorting as they drew rein near the house. The man was middle-aged and soft around the middle, with the kind of carefully waxed mustache that suggested vanity. One of the women was perhaps 50, dressed in burgundy silk that must have cost more than most ranchers made in a month. The other was younger, maybe 30, with pale blonde hair and the kind of delicate features that would have been considered fashionable in Boston. Josiah McCready, the older woman announced as if she were granting an audience rather than paying a visit. We heard you got yourself married yesterday. Mrs. Pritchard, Josiah replied, his voice carefully neutral. Mr. Pritchard, Miss Hartwell, what brings you out this way? Mrs. Pritchard's eyes fixed on Eleanor with the intensity of a hawk studying a mouse. We came to meet the new Mrs. McCready, of course. The whole town's been talking about nothing else since the wedding. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the obvious lie. She was sure the whole town had been talking, but probably not in the way Mrs. Pritchard was suggesting. Eleanor, Josiah said, moving slightly closer to her in a gesture that might have been protective. These are our neighbors from town, Harold and Constance Pritchard and Miss Lucinda Hartwell. How do you do? Eleanor managed, executing a small curtsy that felt ridiculous in her practical ranch clothes. Mrs. Pritchard's smile was sharp as a blade. My, you certainly are. Petite, aren't you, dear? However do you manage around such a large man? The question was loaded with implication, designed to embarrass and diminish. Eleanor felt Josiah stiffen beside her, but before he could speak, she found her voice. The same way anyone manages around someone they care about, she said evenly, with patience and consideration on both sides. Miss Hartwell laughed, a sound like breaking glass. How charming. You make it sound so romantic. But surely the practical considerations must be quite challenging. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept her expression serene. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Hartwell. Oh, I think you do, Mrs. Pritchard interjected, her voice dripping with false sympathy. We're all friends here, dear. Surely you can speak frankly about the unique challenges of your situation. That's enough. Josiah's voice cut through the air like a whip crack, low and dangerous in a way that made all three visitors take an unconscious step backward. I think it's time for you to leave. Now, Josiah, Mr. Pritchard said, speaking for the first time, there's no need to be hostile. We're just concerned neighbors checking on your welfare. My welfare is fine, Josiah replied, his voice still carrying that edge of barely controlled anger, as is my wife's, and I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your concerns to yourselves in the future. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. Of course, dear, we wouldn't dream of intruding, but you must understand people are going to talk. Such an unusual match is bound to attract attention. Let them talk, Eleanor said, suddenly surprising herself with the strength in her voice. I've never found that other people's opinions had much bearing on my happiness. The three visitors exchanged glances loaded with meaning. Miss Hartwell's smile was particularly venomous as she said, How refreshing. Most women would be concerned about their reputation, but I suppose when you're in such desperate circumstances, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. The comment hit its mark, and Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure crack. But before she could respond, Josiah moved forward with surprising speed for such a large man, his presence suddenly looming over the mounted visitors like a storm cloud. I think, he said quietly, that you've overstayed your welcome. The three visitors must have seen something in his face that convinced them arguing would be unwise. They mounted their horses with the huffed dignity of people who'd been denied the entertainment they'd come seeking. Give our regards to Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Pritchard called as they rode away, the parting shot delivered with surgical precision. I'm sure she'll be so interested to hear how you're settling in. Eleanor watched them disappear over the hill, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had stripped away the fragile peace she'd begun to build around their unusual situation. Eleanor, Josiah's voice was gentle, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. Don't let them get to you. Constance Pritchard has been making trouble in this town since before I arrived, and Lucinda Hartwell. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. She had expectations that weren't met when I sent for a wife instead of courting locally. She's beautiful, Eleanor said quietly, the admission tasting like ashes in her mouth. She's poison, Josiah replied bluntly. Beauty without kindness is just decoration, Eleanor. It doesn't mean anything. Eleanor finally looked up at him, this gentle giant who'd defended her without hesitation, who'd built a home with her comfort in mind before he'd even met her. They're right, though, about how unusual this is, about people talking. People always talk, Josiah said, his voice firm, especially people like the Pritchards, who have nothing better to do with their time. But their opinions don't matter. The only opinions that matter are yours and mine. And what's your opinion? Eleanor asked the question, coming out smaller than she'd intended. Josiah was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with sincerity. My opinion is that I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming territory, he said simply, and anyone who can't see that isn't worth our time or attention. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs and making her eyes burn with unshed tears. No one had ever called themselves lucky to have her. No one had ever defended her with such quiet fierceness. No one had ever made her feel like she mattered in quite this way. Josiah, she whispered his name, a prayer and a promise on her lips. Come on, he said gently, offering her his arm. Let's go inside. I think we've had enough visitors for one day. As they walked toward the house together, Eleanor found herself thinking about the careful way he'd positioned himself between her and their unwelcome guests, the quiet authority in his voice when he'd told them to leave. This man, this gentle giant, would protect her, she realized, not just from physical harm, but from the kind of casual cruelty that small-minded people wielded like weapons. It was more than she'd ever dared hope for, and terrifying in its implications. Because protection like that came with a price, and Eleanor was beginning to understand that the cost might be nothing less than her carefully guarded heart. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, both of them seeming to need time to process the morning's events. Eleanor spent time exploring the house more thoroughly, discovering touches that spoke of Josiah's thoughtfulness. A small writing desk positioned near a window that caught the afternoon light, shelves built at a height she could reach without straining, even a mirror hung at the right level for someone her size. As evening approached, she found herself in the kitchen again, this time preparing a proper dinner from the supplies Josiah had stocked. The familiar rhythm of cooking helped calm her nerves, giving her hands something to do while her mind processed the complex emotions the day had stirred up. Josiah appeared just as she was pulling a pan of cornbread from the oven, his hair damp from washing and his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they could bend horseshoes. The sight of him filling the doorway made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Smells like heaven in here, he said, his voice warm with appreciation. It's nothing fancy, Eleanor replied, suddenly self-conscious about the simple meal she'd prepared. Just beef stew and cornbread. It's more than I've had in months, Josiah assured her. I was getting tired of burned biscuits and overcooked beans. They ate by lamplight, the conversation flowing easier than it had that morning. Josiah told her stories about the ranch, about the neighbors she'd eventually meet, about the challenges and rewards of building something from nothing. Eleanor found herself relaxing, charmed by his dry humor and obvious intelligence. You went to school, she observed as he described a complex negotiation with a cattle buyer, more than just the local schoolhouse. Josiah's smile was slightly embarrassed. University, actually. Back east. My father insisted on it, said a man needed more than just size and stubbornness to make his way in the world. What did you study? Engineering, mostly. Some business. Father thought I might go into railroad work or maybe mining. Josiah's expression grew distant. He never understood why I wanted to come west, why I'd rather raise cattle than build bridges. Do you miss it? The East. Sometimes, Josiah admitted, but I miss the libraries, the theaters, the conversations with people who'd read the same books, seen the same plays. But this, he gestured around them, encompassing the house, the ranch, the vast, empty land beyond the windows. This feels like home in a way Boston never did. Eleanor nodded, understanding completely. I think I know what you mean. I never felt like I belonged in Boston either. Too small, too quiet, too ordinary for a city that demanded so much from everyone. You're not ordinary, Josiah said quietly, and something in his voice made Eleanor's breath catch. Ordinary women don't travel halfway across the country to marry a stranger. Ordinary women don't stand up to people like Constance Pritchard. Ordinary women don't. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. Don't make a house feel like a home just by being in it. The compliment hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze, felt something shift and settle in her chest, like a bird finding its nest. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate for the gratitude and growing affection she felt. As the evening wore on, they found themselves sitting by the fire, Eleanor in her perfectly sized rocking chair and Josiah in a massive leather armchair that looked like it had been built specifically for someone his size. The conversation gradually died away, replaced by a comfortable silence broken only by the crackle of burning wood and the distant call of coyotes. Eleanor, Josiah said finally, his voice careful. I want you to know that I meant what I said earlier, about not expecting, about giving you time to get used to this arrangement. Eleanor looked up from the mending she'd been working on, meeting his eyes across the firelit room. I know, she said softly, and I appreciate it more than you might realize. But I also want you to know, he continued, that this doesn't have to stay an arrangement forever. If we, he struggled with the words, this articulate man reduced to stammering by the weight of what he was trying to say. If we, what? Eleanor prompted gently. If we find that we suit each other, Josiah said finally, then maybe someday this could become something more, something real. The words hung in the air between them like a promise, fragile and precious and terrifying in their implications. Eleanor set down her mending and looked at this man who'd given her shelter and safety and kindness without asking for anything in return. This gentle giant who'd defended her honor and built her furniture and offered her a future she'd never dared imagine. I think, she said quietly, I'd like that very much. Josiah's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, transforming his stern features and making him look years younger. Good, he said simply. That's good. As the fire burned low and the night settled around them, like a comfortable blanket, Eleanor found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, she'd found something she'd never expected to have. Not just safety or security or a roof over her head, but the possibility of something deeper, the possibility of love. And for the first time since stepping off that dusty stagecoach, Eleanor Whitfield McCready allowed herself to hope that she might actually have a chance at happiness after all. 3 weeks had passed since that first evening by the fire, and Eleanor was beginning to understand the rhythm of ranch life. She woke each morning to the sound of Josiah moving quietly around the barn, careful not to disturb her sleep, even though she was always awake by the time he finished his chores. They shared breakfast in companionable silence, worked together through the day's tasks, and spent their evenings by the fire reading or talking or simply existing in each other's presence. It was a peaceful life, a good life, but Eleanor could feel the weight of unspoken words growing heavier between them with each passing day. Josiah was unfailingly gentle, unfailingly respectful, and unfailingly careful to maintain the distance she'd initially needed, but the distance was beginning to feel less like protection and more like a wall between them. The morning everything changed started like any other. Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard voices outside, Josiah's deep rumble and higher, more melodious tones that could only belong to women. Her stomach clenched with sudden dread as she recognized one of the voices. Constance Pritchard had returned, and she'd brought reinforcements. Through the window, Eleanor could see 3 women on horseback facing Josiah near the barn. Mrs. Pritchard was flanked by 2 other ladies Eleanor recognized from their brief appearance at the church wedding: Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife, and Mrs. Crawford, who ran the town's only dress shop with the iron efficiency of a military commander. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, the morning air sharp against her face. The conversation stopped abruptly as she appeared 3 pairs of eyes fixing on her with the intensity of predators who'd spotted prey. "Mrs. McCready," Mrs. Pritchard said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How lovely to see you again. We were just telling your husband how concerned the ladies of Ember Ridge are about your adjustment to ranch life." "My adjustment is proceeding quite well, thank you," Eleanor replied, moving to stand beside Josiah. She could feel the tension radiating from his massive frame, could see the way his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. Mrs. Pemberton leaned forward in her saddle, her round face creased with what might have been genuine concern if Eleanor hadn't caught the gleam of malicious curiosity in her eyes. "But surely, my dear, you must find it terribly isolating out here, so far from proper society, from the companionship of other ladies." "I find the solitude quite peaceful, actually," Eleanor said evenly. "After the crowds and noise of Boston, this is exactly what I needed." Mrs. Crawford, a thin woman with steel-gray hair and a mouth that looked like it had been permanently pursed in disapproval, shook her head sadly. "But what about church? Dear, Sunday services are so important for a woman's spiritual well-being, and you haven't been to town since your wedding." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, knowing exactly what the woman was implying. A good wife would insist on attending church, would make her husband's spiritual obligations a priority. The fact that they hadn't been to town was being presented as evidence of Eleanor's failure as a Christian woman. "We've been reading scripture together in the evenings," Eleanor said, which was true. Josiah owned a beautiful leather-bound Bible, and they'd taken to reading passages aloud by the fire. And Reverend Williams said he understood that the ranch requires constant attention, especially with winter coming. "How convenient," Mrs. Pritchard murmured, and the other women exchanged meaningful glances. "But surely you understand that appearances matter, my dear. People talk, and when a couple isolates themselves so completely—" "What exactly are people saying?" Josiah's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, low and dangerous, in a way that made all 3 women straighten in their saddles. Mrs. Pemberton had the grace to look uncomfortable, but Mrs. Pritchard smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this opening. "Well, naturally, people are curious about how you're managing. Such an unusual situation is bound to generate interest." Her eyes glittered with malice as she continued. "Some folks are wondering if the marriage is even legitimate, given how rarely you're seen together in public." The implication hit Eleanor like a physical blow. They were suggesting that the marriage was a sham, that she and Josiah were living in sin because they couldn't possibly be fulfilling their marital duties given their difference in size. The accusation was couched in concern and veiled in politeness, but the cruelty behind it was unmistakable. "I think," Josiah said, his voice carrying a warning that would have made a wise person retreat, "that you ladies have said quite enough." But Mrs. Crawford wasn't finished. Leaning forward with the zeal of someone delivering a killing blow, she said, "We're only thinking of Mrs. McCready's reputation, of course. A woman in her position needs the support and guidance of other ladies. Perhaps if she came to town more often, joined the church auxiliary, showed herself to be a proper wife." A proper wife! Eleanor heard her own voice, as if from a distance, sharp with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. "And what exactly would make me a proper wife in your estimation, Mrs. Crawford?" The older woman blinked clearly, not having expected Eleanor nor to fight back. "Well, naturally a wife should, that is, she should be seen supporting her husband publicly, should take an active role in the community." should prove to a bunch of gossips that her marriage is real enough to satisfy their curiosity. Eleanor finished, her voice rising with each word. Should parade herself around town like a trained animal to convince people who have nothing better to do than speculate about her private life. Mrs. Pritchard's smile turned predatory. There's no need to be defensive, dear. We're simply suggesting that a woman in your unique circumstances might benefit from the counsel of more experienced wives. Experienced in what? Eleanor shot back. In tearing down other women, in spreading poison disguised as concern, in making sure that anyone who doesn't fit your narrow definition of acceptable is driven out of town. The three women exchanged shocked glances, clearly not having expected such resistance from someone they'd obviously pegged as a timid mouse. Now see here, Mrs. Pemberton began, but Eleanor was past caring about politeness. No, you see here, she said, stepping forward despite the way the horses shied at her sudden movement. I came to this town as Josiah McCready's wife, and I've done nothing to shame him or myself. If people want to gossip about our marriage, that says more about their character than it does about ours. Mrs. Crawford's face flushed red with indignation. How dare you suggest that we— How dare I? Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. How dare you come to my home and insult my husband and my marriage under the guise of Christian concern? How dare you imply that we're living in sin because you can't imagine how two people who care about each other might make their differences work? Eleanor, Josiah's voice was quiet, but it carried a warning. When she looked up at him, she could see both pride and concern in his green eyes. He was proud of her for standing up to them, but worried about the consequences of making such powerful enemies. But Eleanor was beyond caution now. Weeks of swallowed insults and veiled accusations had built up like water behind a dam, and Mrs. Pritchard's visit had finally broken it open. You want to know the truth about my marriage? She continued, her voice ringing across the ranch yard. The truth is that Josiah McCready is the kindest, most generous man I've ever known. He's gentle and patient and decent, in ways that men twice his education and half his size have never managed. He built me furniture so I'd be comfortable in his home. He gave up his own bedroom so I'd feel safe. He defends me against my small-minded people who can't see past the surface of things. Mrs. Pritchard's smile had frozen into something ugly and sharp. How romantic. But romance doesn't solve practical problems, does it? Some differences are simply too great to overcome. Is that what you think? Eleanor asked, and something in her voice made all three women lean back in their saddles. That we're too different, that love can't bridge the gap between us. Love. Mrs. Crawford's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. My dear child, you've been married 3 weeks. Whatever you think you're feeling, it isn't love. The words hit their mark, but not in the way Mrs. Crawford had intended. Instead of shame or doubt, Eleanor felt a sudden blazing certainty that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her bones. You're wrong, she said quietly, and the conviction in her voice made even Mrs. Pritchard stop smiling. You're wrong about love, and you're wrong about my marriage, and you're wrong about what's possible between two people who are brave enough to try. Before anyone could respond, Eleanor turned and walked back toward the house, her spine straight and her head high. Behind her she could hear Josiah's voice, low and controlled, but carrying an edge of steel that suggested the three visitors had finally pushed him past the limits of his patience. I think it's time for you ladies to leave, he said, and something in his tone must have convinced them that arguing would be unwise. Eleanor didn't watch them go. Instead, she stood at the kitchen window, her hands pressed against the glass, her heart racing with the aftermath of adrenaline and the shocking realization of what she'd just admitted. She loved him. The knowledge hit her like a thunderbolt, sudden and undeniable and terrifying in its implications. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, without her even realizing it was happening, Josiah McCready had crept past all her carefully constructed defenses and taken up residence in her heart. The front door opened and closed, and Eleanor heard Josiah's heavy footsteps crossing the main room. She turned to face him, suddenly uncertain and vulnerable in a way she hadn't felt since that first night. "Eleanor." His voice was gentle, but she could see the worry in his eyes. "Are you all right?" "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know I shouldn't have lost my temper like that. I know they're influential people in town, and I've probably made things difficult for you." "Eleanor." He said her name more firmly, and something in his tone made her stop talking. "You have nothing to apologize for. What you said out there, the way you defended us, defended our marriage." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "No one has ever done that for me before." "They had no right," Eleanor said fiercely. "No right to come here and insult you, to question our marriage, to imply that we're somehow, that we can't." She faltered, suddenly aware of what she'd been about to say. That they couldn't be intimate, couldn't have a real marriage, couldn't overcome the physical differences between them. The very things she'd been wondering about herself, the fears that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about the man sleeping in the barn. "Eleanor." Josiah's voice was rough now, heavy, with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "What you said about love." Her cheeks burned, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "I meant it. Even though we've only known each other 3 weeks. Even though," Eleanor confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. Josiah was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes searching her face, as if he could read the truth written there. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "I love you too." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, felt something inside her chest crack open and spill warmth through her entire body. "You do, from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach and looked up at me without flinching," Josiah said, moving closer until she had to crane her neck back to see his face. "From the first morning when you offered to help with the biscuits instead of just watching me struggle. From every evening by the fire when you made this house feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep." "But I'm so small," Eleanor whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted her since their first meeting. "And you're so big." Josiah's smile was gentle as he reached out to cup her face in his massive hand, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Eleanor, my size has been nothing but a burden my whole life. I've been too big for furniture, too big for doorways, too big for the world I was born into. But with you—" He paused, his eyes soft with wonder. "With you, I finally feel like I fit." Eleanor leaned into his touch, amazed by how perfectly her cheek nestled into his palm. "I've been afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that we're too different, that people like Mrs. Pritchard are right, that we'll never be able to make this work." "Are you still afraid?" Josiah asked. Eleanor thought about it seriously, examining the fear that had been her constant companion since arriving in Ember Ridge. It was still there, but it was smaller now, overwhelmed by something stronger and more powerful. "Yes," she said honestly, "but I'm more brave than I am afraid." Josiah's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "That's all we need," he said simply. "Courage and love and the determination to prove everyone wrong." "What if they're not wrong?" Eleanor asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if we really are too different?" "Then we'll figure it out," Josiah said with quiet confidence. "Together, the way married people are supposed to." The promise in his voice, the absolute certainty that they could overcome anything as long as they faced it together, made Eleanor's heart flutter like a caged bird suddenly set free. "Josiah," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. He bent down until their faces were level, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "May I kiss you, Eleanor? Really kiss you this time?" Eleanor's answer was to rise up on her toes, closing the distance between them until their lips met in the middle. This kiss was nothing like the chaste peck they'd shared at their wedding. This was fire and promise, and the kind of desperate hunger that comes from weeks of careful distance finally bridged. Josiah's arms came around her, lifting her off her feet and against his chest. and Eleanor felt the rightness of it in her bones. This was where she belonged, not just in his arms, but in his life, in his heart, in the space they were creating together despite all the odds against them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor kept her hands fisted in the fabric of his shirt, unwilling to let him step away. "Those women," she said suddenly, "they'll spread this all over town, what I said, how I defended us. They'll make it sound like you love your husband and aren't ashamed of it," Josiah asked, and Eleanor could hear the smile in his voice. "Let them talk, Eleanor. Let the whole territory talk if they want to. I'm proud to be loved by you, and I'm not going to hide it." Eleanor looked up at him, this gentle giant who'd given her everything she'd never dared dream of, and felt a fierce surge of protective love that surprised her with its intensity. Let the town gossips say what they wanted. Let them whisper and speculate and disapprove. She'd found something worth fighting for, worth defending, worth cherishing. She'd found her home. The rest of the morning passed in a kind of golden haze, both of them moving around each other with the careful consideration of people learning a new dance. But there was an ease between them now that hadn't been there before, a sense of rightness that came from finally acknowledging what had been growing between them all along. It was just after noon when they heard the sound of an approaching wagon. This time, Eleanor didn't feel the clutch of anxiety in her stomach. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The wagon that appeared over the rise was loaded with lumber and driven by a man Eleanor didn't recognize, middle-aged, weathered, with the kind of competent hands that marked him as someone who made his living with tools. "That's Ben Morrison," Josiah said, moving to stand beside Eleanor on the porch. "He's the best carpenter in the territory. I sent word asking him to come out and look at some improvements I want to make to the house." "Improvements?" Eleanor asked, curious. Josiah's cheeks colored slightly beneath his beard. "I thought, that is, if you're agreeable, I'd like to add on to the house. Maybe build a proper nursery, expand the kitchen a bit, make it more suitable for—" He trailed off suddenly, looking uncertain. "For a family," Eleanor finished softly, and the hope in her voice made Josiah's entire face light up. "For a family," he confirmed. Ben Morrison climbed down from his wagon with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been protesting heavy labor for more years than he cared to count. He was shorter than average, which made him look almost tiny next to Josiah, but he had the kind of presence that suggested competence and reliability. "Josiah," he said, extending a weathered hand. "Good to see you again, and this must be the missus I've heard so much about." "Eleanor McCready," Eleanor said, accepting his handshake with a smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Morrison." "Ben, please." "And the pleasure's all mine, ma'am. Josiah here has been talking about improvements to this place for months, but he never could settle on what he wanted. I'm guessing that's changed now." Eleanor glanced up at Josiah, seeing the shy hope in his eyes, and felt her heart expand with love and possibility. "I think it has," she said softly. They spent the afternoon walking around the house, with Ben discussing potential additions and modifications. Eleanor found herself drawn into the planning despite her complete lack of experience with construction, her suggestions taken seriously by both men. A larger kitchen with more workspace, a proper dining room for entertaining, and yes, a nursery that could be expanded as their family grew. "You'll want good, thick walls," Ben said, as they stood in what would become the new wing. "Winters out here can be brutal, and you'll want to keep the little ones warm." "Little ones," Eleanor repeated softly, and the word sent a thrill of anticipation and terror through her in equal measure. Josiah must have heard something in her voice, because his hand found hers and squeezed gently. "Only if you want them," he said quietly. "There's no rush, Eleanor. We have all the time in the world." But even as he said it, Eleanor could see the longing in his eyes. This man who'd built a ranch with his own hands, who'd created something beautiful and lasting from nothing but determination and dreams, wanted to share it with children who would carry on what he'd started. The knowledge made her chest tight with emotion and fierce determination. She wanted to give him that. Wanted to fill this house with the sound of children's laughter, wanted to watch him teach his sons and daughters the lessons this land had taught him, wanted to create something together that would outlast them both. "I want them," she said, and the simple admission made Josiah's eyes shine with unshed tears. Ben pretended not to notice the emotional undercurrents swirling around them, instead focusing on the practical matters of foundation and framing and the dozens of other details that would turn their dreams into reality. "I can start as soon as the materials arrive," he said finally. "Should have the basic structure up before the worst of winter hits, then finish the interior work when the weather breaks." As they watched Ben drive away, his wagon empty now and his notebook full of measurements and specifications, Eleanor leaned against Josiah's side and tried to absorb the magnitude of what they'd just planned. "Are we crazy?" she asked quietly. "Planning a nursery when we've been married less than a month?" "Probably," Josiah admitted, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "But the good kind of crazy, the kind that builds something worth having." Eleanor thought about Mrs. Pritchard and her venomous friends, about the whispers and speculation that would only grow worse when news of the addition spread through town. Let them talk, let them question and gossip and disapprove. She and Josiah would be too busy building a life together to pay them any attention. The storm arrived just after sunset, rolling in from the west with the kind of violent intensity that made the house shake and the windows rattle in their frames. Eleanor had seen storms before, but nothing like this lightning that turned the sky. White as noon thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself, wind that howled like something alive and hungry. She was in the kitchen washing dishes when the first crack of thunder made her jump, nearly dropping the plate in her hands. The second crack was so loud it seemed to split the world in half, and Eleanor couldn't stop the small cry of fear that escaped her lips. "Eleanor," Josiah's voice came from the main room, concerned and immediate. "I'm fine," she called back, but another flash of lightning illuminated the kitchen in stark detail, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Eleanor pressed her back against the counter, her heart racing with a fear that was completely out of proportion to the situation. It wasn't just the storm, she realized. It was everything: the confrontation with Mrs. Pritchard, the admission of love, the plans for children and additions, and a future that suddenly seemed both wonderful and terrifying. All of it had combined to leave her feeling raw and vulnerable, as if her emotions were sitting just beneath her skin. Another flash of lightning, another crash of thunder, and Eleanor found herself moving before she'd consciously decided to do so. She walked into the main room where Josiah sat, reading by the fire, his massive frame somehow reassuring in the face of nature's fury. "The storm," she said unnecessarily, and he looked up from his book with concern. "It's a big one," he agreed, "but the house is solid. We're safe here." Eleanor nodded, but she didn't move away from the doorway. Another flash of lightning lit up the windows, followed by thunder that seemed to go on forever. Without thinking, she moved toward Josiah's chair, drawn by the promise of safety and warmth he represented. "Eleanor," he said softly, setting aside his book. "What is it?" "I don't like storms," she admitted, feeling foolish. "I know it's silly, but they've always frightened me, ever since I was a child." Josiah studied her face in the firelight, seeing something there that made him open his arms in silent invitation. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She crossed the space between them and let him pull her onto his lap, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his chest, how his arms seemed designed to shelter her from the world. "Better?" he asked, his voice rumbling against her ear. "Much," Eleanor whispered, and meant it. Here, surrounded by his warmth and strength, the storm seemed less threatening, just weather instead of something to fear. They sat like that as the storm raged outside, Eleanor curled against Josiah's chest, while he stroked her hair with infinite gentleness. The thunder still made her jump, but each flash of lightning seemed less frightening when she was safe in his arms. "Thank you," she said finally when the worst of the storm had passed and the thunder had faded to distant grumbling. "For what?" "For making me feel safe," Eleanor said simply. "I've never had that before. Someone who made the world feel less dangerous just by being there." Josiah's arms tightened around her, and when she looked up at him, his eyes were dark with emotion. "You make me feel necessary," he said quietly. "Like all this, the ranch, the house, everything I've built finally has a purpose." Eleanor reached up to trace the line of his jaw, marveling at the contrast between his size and gentleness. "What's our purpose, Josiah? What are we building together?" "Everything," he said simply. "A marriage, a family, a legacy. Something that will outlast us both and prove that love really can conquer anything." Eleanor smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones like warmth from the fire. They were different in every possible way: size, background experience, expectations. But they fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been searching for each other across vast distances and impossible odds. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling with possibility. And in the warm circle of Josiah's arms, Eleanor finally understood that some things, the most important things, weren't about overcoming differences. They were about celebrating them. The morning after the storm dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry for miles. Eleanor woke in Josiah's arms on the sofa where they'd fallen asleep, her head pillowed on his chest and his massive hand resting protectively on her back. For a moment she simply lay there, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and marveling at how right it felt to wake up this way. Josiah stirred beneath her, his arms tightening reflexively before his eyes opened. When he saw her watching him, a slow smile spread across his features. "Good morning, Mrs. McCready," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning, Mr. McCready," Eleanor replied, making no move to leave the warm circle of his arms. "Did we sleep here all night?" "Seems we did." Josiah's hand moved to stroke her hair, the gesture so tender it made Eleanor's heart flutter. "Any regrets?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. She'd spent the night in her husband's arms, not in the way Mrs. Pritchard and her friends would have expected, but in something deeper and more meaningful. She'd found safety and comfort, and the kind of peace she'd never known existed. "None," she said firmly, and was rewarded with another of those transformative smiles. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual visiting. Josiah sat up, carefully settling Eleanor beside him on the sofa before moving to the window. "It's Doc Harrison," he said, and Eleanor could hear the worry in his voice. "And Sheriff Mitchell. Something's wrong." Dr. Harrison was a small, energetic man in his 60s who'd been serving the scattered ranches and farms around Ember Ridge for more than 20 years. Eleanor had met him briefly at their wedding, where he'd struck her as the kind of no-nonsense medical man who could set a bone or deliver a baby with equal competence. Sheriff Mitchell was younger, maybe 40, with the kind of steady presence that suggested he'd earned his position through ability rather than politics. Josiah opened the door before the two men could knock, his massive frame filling the doorway. "Doc, Sheriff, what brings you out this way so early?" "We need to talk, Josiah," Dr. Harrison said, dismounting with the stiff movements of a man who'd spent too many years in the saddle. "About what happened in town yesterday." Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach. The confrontation with Mrs. Pritchard and her friends, somehow she'd known it wouldn't end there. "Come in," Josiah said, stepping aside to let the men enter. "Eleanor, you remember Doc Harrison and Sheriff Mitchell?" "Of course," Eleanor said, rising to greet them. "Gentlemen, can I offer you coffee?" "That'd be appreciated, ma'am," Sheriff Mitchell said, removing his hat. "It's been a long ride." As Eleanor busied herself in the kitchen, she could hear the low murmur of male voices from the main room. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was serious concern. Whatever had brought these men out to the ranch at dawn wasn't good news. She returned with coffee and found the three men seated around the fireplace, their expressions grim. Dr. Harrison accepted his cup with a grateful nod, then fixed his attention on Eleanor. "Mrs. McCready, I understand you had some words with Constance Pritchard and her friends yesterday morning." "I did," Eleanor said evenly, taking her seat beside Josiah. "They came here uninvited and made some very unpleasant insinuations about our marriage. And you responded with some rather forceful comments about their character," Sheriff Mitchell said. "It wasn't a question." Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "I defended my husband and my marriage against people who had no business questioning either." Dr. Harrison leaned forward, his expression troubled. "Mrs. McCready, I need you to understand something about Constance Pritchard. She's not just a gossip, she's a woman with considerable influence in this town. Her husband owns the largest mercantile, and she has the ear of every important family within 50 miles. What the doc is trying to say," Sheriff Mitchell added, "is that Mrs. Pritchard doesn't take kindly to being challenged, especially not in public, and especially not by someone she considers beneath her station." Eleanor felt Josiah tense beside her, felt the dangerous stillness that came over him when he was truly angry. "Are you suggesting that my wife should have allowed herself to be insulted in her own home?" he asked, his voice deceptively quiet. "I'm suggesting," Dr. Harrison said carefully, "that Mrs. Pritchard is now actively working to make life difficult for both of you. She's been spreading stories, Josiah, nasty ones." "What kind of stories?" Eleanor asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Sheriff Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "She's telling people that your marriage is a sham, that you're living in sin because of the physical differences between you. She's claiming that no proper Christian woman would defend such an arrangement so vehemently unless she had something to hide." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Josiah was on his feet, his sighs suddenly seeming less gentle and more threatening. "She's questioning the legitimacy of our marriage." His voice was low and dangerous, and both visitors leaned back slightly. "It gets worse," Dr. Harrison said quietly. "She's convinced Reverend Williams to call for a church inquiry. They want you both to appear before the church board to prove that your marriage is legitimate." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, an inquiry as if they were criminals rather than a married couple trying to build a life together, as if their love was somehow suspect because it didn't fit the narrow mold of what people expected. "On what grounds?" Josiah demanded. "Moral concerns." Sheriff Mitchell said, his distaste for the situation evident. "Mrs. Pritchard has convinced enough influential families that there are irregularities in your marriage that require investigation." Eleanor stood slowly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What exactly are they asking us to prove? And how?" Dr. Harrison looked deeply uncomfortable. "They want testimony from both of you about the intimate nature of your relationship. They want medical examination to confirm—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "To confirm what?" Eleanor pressed, though she could already guess what he was going to say. "To confirm that the marriage has been consummated," Dr. Harrison said finally. "They want proof that you're truly man and wife in all senses." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications of what they were asking hit her. They wanted her to submit to medical examination, intimate, invasive, humiliating examination, to prove to a panel of judgmental strangers that she and Josiah had fulfilled their marital duties. "No." Josiah's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Absolutely not." "Josiah," Sheriff Mitchell said carefully, "if you don't appear willingly, they can force the issue. Mrs. Pritchard has convinced the territorial judge that there are grounds for investigation. They can have your marriage annulled if you refuse to cooperate." "Let them try," Josiah said flatly. "I won't have my wife subjected to that kind of humiliation for the entertainment of a bunch of small-minded gossips." Eleanor looked at the three men, Dr. Harrison with his obvious sympathy, Sheriff Mitchell with his reluctant duty, and Josiah with his protective fury, and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. This was what her life would be like here. Always defending, always proving, always having to justify her existence to people who'd already decided she didn't belong. "What if we did it?" she said quietly, and all three men turned to stare at her. "Eleanor, no," Josiah said immediately. "I won't let you. What if we gave them what they want?" Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "What if we appeared before their board and answered their questions and submitted to their examination? What then?" Dr. Harrison looked deeply troubled. "Then they'd have to accept the legitimacy of your marriage. But Eleanor, you don't understand what you're suggesting. The examination would be invasive, humiliating, and the questions they'd ask would be no different from the whispers they're already spreading," Eleanor finished. "At least this way it would be over. We could put an end to the speculation once and for all." "You don't have to do this," Josiah said, moving to kneel beside her chair so they were eye to eye. "We can leave, start over somewhere else where people don't know us." Eleanor looked at him, this gentle giant who'd given her everything she'd never dared dream of, and felt her resolve harden. "Run away. Leave the ranch you've spent years building. Let them drive us out because they can't accept that we love each other." "If it means protecting you from this, yes," Josiah said without hesitation. Eleanor reached out to cup his face in her hands, marveling as always at the contrast between his size and gentleness. "I won't run, Josiah. I won't let them win. If they want proof that our marriage is real, then we'll give them proof." "Eleanor," Dr. Harrison said gently, "you need to understand what this would involve. The examination would confirm whether or not you've been intimate with your husband. If you haven't, then we'll make sure we have," Eleanor said simply, and the words hung in the air like a challenge to fate itself. Josiah's eyes widened, and Eleanor could see the war between desire and protectiveness playing out across his features. "Eleanor, you don't have to. We don't have to." "Yes, we do," Eleanor said firmly. "Not because they're forcing us to, but because it's time. Because I love you and you love me, and we're married, and there's no reason to wait any longer." She turned to address Dr. Harrison and Sheriff Mitchell, her chin lifted with determination. "When is this inquiry scheduled?" 2 weeks from today," Sheriff Mitchell said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "But Mrs. McCready, you should know that even if the examination confirms what they're looking for, they might still find other grounds to question your marriage." "Such as?" Dr. Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There are concerns about compatibility, about whether a woman of your size could safely bear children to a man of Josiah's stature. Some are suggesting that even a consummated marriage might be considered invalid if it poses a danger to your health." Eleanor felt the room spin around her, felt the careful hopes and dreams she'd been building crumble like a house of cards. They weren't just questioning her marriage, they were questioning her right to have children, her ability to be a complete wife to the man she loved. "That's enough," Josiah said, rising to his feet with barely controlled fury. "You've delivered your message. Now I think it's time for you to leave." Dr. Harrison stood, but he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he looked at Eleanor with genuine concern. "Mrs. McCready, as your physician, I have to advise you to think very carefully about this. The physical challenges would be significant. And if you were to become pregnant, then we'll face those challenges when we come to them." Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Just like every married couple faces the risks and uncertainties of life together." After the two men left, Eleanor and Josiah sat in silence for a long time, both struggling to process what they'd just learned. The house that had felt like a sanctuary now seemed exposed, vulnerable to the malicious intentions of people who couldn't, accept that love came in many forms. "You don't have to do this," Josiah said finally. "Any of it. We can leave today, start over somewhere else." Eleanor looked around the main room, at the furniture he'd built by hand, at the books lining the walls, at the rocking chair that fit her perfectly. This was their home, their life, their future. She wouldn't let a handful of small-minded people destroy what they'd started to build. "I'm not running," she said firmly, "and neither are you." "Eleanor, you heard what Doc Harrison said. The risks." "I heard him," Eleanor interrupted. "But I also heard something else. I heard fear, Josiah. Not medical certainty, but fear of the unknown, fear of something they've never seen before." Josiah moved to sit beside her, his massive frame somehow managing to look vulnerable. "What if they're right? What if I am too big for you? What if I hurt you?" Eleanor turned to face him fully, seeing the genuine terror in his green eyes. This man who could lift a full-grown bull was afraid of hurting her, not just physically, but in ways that went much deeper. "Do you trust me?" she asked quietly. "With my life," Josiah said without hesitation. "Then trust me with this. Trust me to know my own body, my own limits, my own heart." Eleanor reached for his hands, her small fingers threading through his massive ones. "Trust me to love you enough to make this work." Josiah stared down at their joined hands for a long moment, and Eleanor could see the internal battle he was fighting. Finally, he raised his eyes to meet hers. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it right. We take our time, we're careful, and if at any point you want to stop, we stop." Eleanor agreed. "But Josiah, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this just to prove a point to Mrs. Pritchard and her friends. I'm doing this because I want to, because I love you and I want to be your wife in every sense of the word." The admission seemed to break something open in Josiah's chest. He pulled her into his arms, holding her against him, with a desperation that spoke of weeks of careful restraint finally cracking. "Eleanor," he whispered against her hair, "are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Eleanor replied and felt the truth of it resonate in her bones. That evening they sat by the fire as they had every night since Eleanor's arrival, but everything felt different now. The air between them hummed with anticipation and nervous energy, with the knowledge that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Are you frightened?" Josiah asked as Eleanor set aside her mending. Eleanor considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said finally, "but not of you, never of you." "Then what? Of failing," Eleanor admitted, "of not being enough for you, of disappointing you after all this buildup." Josiah's laugh was soft and full of wonder. "Eleanor, you could never disappoint me. Just the fact that you're willing to try, that you trust me enough to—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I'm the one who should be worried about disappointing you." Eleanor stood and moved to his chair, settling herself on his lap as she had during the storm. This time, though, the gesture felt different, more intimate, charged with new possibilities. "Tell me what you're thinking, she said, her hands resting on his chest. "That I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person," Josiah said simply. "That I want to make this good for you, want to show you how precious you are to me. That I'm terrified I'll somehow ruin it because I don't know how to be gentle enough for someone so small and perfect." Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him, pouring all her love and trust and determination into the contact. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. "Then we'll learn together," she whispered. "We'll figure it out the way married people always have, with patience and love and the faith that what we have is worth fighting for." Josiah's arms tightened around her, and Eleanor could feel the tension in his massive frame, the careful control he was exercising to keep from overwhelming her. She marveled at his restraint, at the way this giant of a man could hold her as if she were made of spun glass. "I love you," he said, the words carrying the weight of a vow. "I love you too," Eleanor replied. "Now show me." What followed was a lesson in tenderness, in the way love could bridge any gap and overcome any obstacle. Josiah carried her to their bedroom now not just his, with the reverence of a man handling something sacred. He was infinitely patient, infinitely gentle, infinitely careful to make sure she felt cherished rather than overwhelmed. And if there were moments of awkwardness, of uncertainty about how to fit together when they were so different in size, there were also moments of perfect connection that took Eleanor's breath away. Moments when she understood that love wasn't about being the same, it was about choosing to be different together. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion. Not just physical, though, that had been more wonderful than she'd dared hope, but emotional, spiritual. She felt like she'd finally found the missing piece of herself she hadn't even known was lost. "No regrets?" Josiah asked softly, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor smiled against his chest, feeling safe and cherished and utterly content. "Only that we waited so long." Josiah's laugh rumbled through his chest, and Eleanor felt the vibration all the way to her bones. Mrs. Pritchard is going to be very disappointed when her inquiry doesn't go the way she's planning. "Let her be disappointed," Eleanor said fiercely. "We know the truth about our marriage now. That's all that matters." As sleep began to claim them both, Eleanor found herself thinking about the future they were building together. There would be challenges, the inquiry, the gossip, the very real concerns about children, and the physical differences between them. But they would face all of it together with love and determination, and the unshakable conviction that what they had was worth fighting for. 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood before her mirror, smoothing her best dress and trying to calm the butterflies in her stomach. Today was the day of the church inquiry, the day she and Josiah would have to prove to a panel of strangers that their marriage was legitimate and moral and worthy of recognition. Dr. Harrison had already conducted his examination, his professional demeanor not quite masking his relief at being able to confirm what Eleanor and Josiah already knew: their marriage was real in every sense that mattered. But the inquiry would still proceed because Mrs. Pritchard wasn't content with medical evidence. She wanted public validation of her suspicions or public vindication of her accusations. "Ready?" Josiah asked, appearing in the doorway of their bedroom. Eleanor turned to look at him, this gentle giant who'd become the center of her world, and felt her courage steady. Whatever happened today, they would face it together. "Ready," she said, and meant it. The church was packed when they arrived, filled with faces both familiar and strange. Eleanor could see Mrs. Pritchard in the front row, flanked by her usual allies, their expressions avid with anticipation. But she could also see Mrs. Henderson from the general store, Ben Morrison the carpenter, and a dozen other faces that looked sympathetic rather than hostile. The inquiry itself was a formal affair conducted by Reverend Williams and a panel of church elders. They asked questions about the wedding, about their living arrangements, about their faith and their intentions. Eleanor answered each query with quiet dignity, refusing to be intimidated by the barely veiled hostility of some of the questioners. When they asked about the intimate nature of their marriage, Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "My husband and I have a normal, loving marriage in every respect," she said clearly. Dr. Harrison's examination confirmed this. Mrs. Pritchard rose from her seat, her face flushed with frustration. "But surely you must acknowledge the irregularities of your situation, the physical incompatibility that makes a normal marriage impossible." Eleanor stood, feeling Josiah's supportive presence beside her, like an anchor in a storm. "What I acknowledge," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "is that love doesn't measure itself in inches or pounds. What I acknowledge is that my husband is the kindest, most gentle man I've ever known, and that I'm proud to be his wife." "But the risks," Mrs. Crawford called out from the crowd, "the danger to yourself and any children you might have." "Every marriage carries risks," Eleanor replied. "Every pregnancy, every birth, every life involves uncertainty and potential danger. That's what faith is for, trusting that God will provide what we need to face whatever challenges come our way." Reverend Williams called for order as murmurs spread through the crowd, but Eleanor wasn't finished. She looked out over the assembled faces, seeing curiosity and judgment and fascination in equal measure, and made a decision that would change everything. "You want to know the truth about my marriage?" she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "The truth is that Josiah McCready saved my life, not just by giving me a home and a name, but by showing me what it means to be truly loved, to be cherished and protected and valued for who I am rather than what I can provide." She turned to look at Josiah, seeing the love and pride shining in his green eyes, and felt her heart overflow with certainty. "The truth is that I would rather face any risk, any challenge, any hardship with him than live a safe, empty life without him. The truth is that our differences don't divide us, they complete us. And if that's not a miracle worth celebrating, then I don't know what is." The church fell silent, Eleanor's words hanging in the air like a benediction. Even Mrs. Pritchard seemed stunned into speechlessness, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Reverend Williams cleared his throat, his expression thoughtful. "I think," he said slowly, "that we've heard enough. This inquiry is concluded." Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief, felt Josiah's strong arm come around her waist to support her. They'd done it. They'd faced down the gossips and the doubters and emerged victorious. But as they walked out of the church together, Eleanor knew this was just the beginning. There would be other challenges, other tests of their love and commitment. The question of children still loomed large, fraught with uncertainty and potential heartbreak. But they would face it all together with love and faith and the unshakable conviction that some things, the most important things, were worth any risk. And as Josiah helped her into their wagon, his touch gentle and reverent as always, Eleanor allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, their love really could conquer anything, even the impossible. The months that followed the church inquiry passed like a gentle dream. Eleanor and Josiah settled into the rhythm of married life with the easy contentment of two people who'd found their perfect match. The addition to the house was completed just as the first snows began to fall, and Eleanor spent the long winter evenings arranging the nursery, her hands gentle on the tiny furniture Josiah had crafted with his own massive ones. By spring, Eleanor's hopes were answered. She was with child. The news came on a morning when the prairie was painted with wildflowers and the air was sweet with the promise of new life. Eleanor had suspected for weeks, had felt the subtle changes in her body with a mixture of joy and terror when Dr. Harrison confirmed what she already knew. In her heart, she nearly wept with happiness. Josiah's reaction was everything she could have hoped for and more. When she told him sitting in their kitchen over morning coffee, he went perfectly still for a moment before his face broke into the most radiant smile she'd ever seen. "A baby," he whispered as if he couldn't quite believe it. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, though she could see the answer written across his features. "Happy?" Josiah's laugh was thick with emotion. "Eleanor, I've never been happier about anything in my entire life." He moved around the table to kneel beside her chair, his massive hands settling gently on her still flat stomach. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "I'm your papa, and I already love you more than all the stars in the sky." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears at the tenderness in his voice, at the picture he made kneeling beside her chair, with his hands cradling their unborn child. This was what she'd dreamed of, what she'd hoped for, despite all the warnings and doubts. this moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. But the joy was tempered by the reality of what lay ahead. Dr. Harrison had been cautious in his congratulations, his examination thorough, and his questions pointed. The concerns that had been raised during the church inquiry hadn't disappeared. If anything, they'd grown more pressing with the reality of pregnancy. "We need to be very careful," Dr. Harrison had told them after confirming the pregnancy. "Very watchful. The baby will likely be larger than average given Josiah's size, and Eleanor's frame is—" He'd paused, choosing his words diplomatically. "Delicate." Eleanor had lifted her chin at the barely veiled concern in his voice. "Women my size have had babies before, doctor. Successfully." "Yes," Dr. Harrison had agreed, "but not usually to fathers of Josiah's stature. This will be uncharted territory for all of us." As the pregnancy progressed, Eleanor began to understand what he'd meant. By her 4th month, she was already showing more than most women at 6 months. By her 6th month, she looked ready to give birth any day. Her tiny frame struggled to accommodate the growing child, and simple tasks became increasingly difficult. Josiah hovered over her like an anxious mother hen, anticipating her every need before she could voice it. He hired a woman from town to help with the household tasks, built steps and handholds throughout the house to help her navigate her changing body, and fretted constantly about her comfort and well-being. "I'm fine," Eleanor assured him repeatedly as he helped her into the specially modified rocking chair he'd built. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Josiah. I'm not made of glass." "You're made of something much more precious," Josiah replied, settling a soft blanket around her legs. "And I'm not taking any chances with either of you." The townspeople watched Eleanor's pregnancy with the fascination of spectators at a horse race, some betting on her survival while others whispered predictions of disaster. Mrs. Pritchard, defeated but not silenced by the church inquiry, made pointed comments about the wisdom of natural limitations whenever Eleanor appeared in public. But there were also unexpected sources of support. Mrs. Henderson visited regularly, bringing supplies and sage advice from her own experiences as a mother. Ben Morrison's wife Sarah became a close friend, sharing stories of her own difficult pregnancies and offering the kind of practical wisdom that only came from lived experience. "Every baby finds a way to be born," Sarah told Eleanor one afternoon as they sat in the completed nursery. "Trust your body, trust your baby, and trust the good Lord to see you through." Eleanor wanted to believe her, but as her 7th month arrived, the challenges became impossible to ignore. She could barely walk without assistance. Her breathing was labored and the baby's movements were so strong they left her gasping. Dr. Harrison's visits became more frequent, his expression more worried with each examination. "The baby is large," he told Josiah quietly one evening, thinking Eleanor couldn't hear from the bedroom. "Larger than I initially estimated. And Eleanor's pelvis." He sighed heavily. "I'm not sure she'll be able to deliver naturally." Eleanor pressed her ear closer to the door, her heart pounding as she listened to the conversation that would determine her fate. "What are you saying?" Josiah's voice was tight, with barely controlled fear. "I'm saying we need to prepare for the possibility that surgical intervention might be necessary. It's dangerous, more dangerous than a natural birth, but it might be the only way to save both mother and child." Eleanor closed her eyes, one hand resting on her swollen belly, where their child moved restlessly, as if sensing the tension surrounding its impending arrival. Surgery was risky under the best of circumstances, and these were far from the best of circumstances. The nearest hospital was 2 days' ride away, and even if they could get there in time, there was no guarantee that the doctors would have the skill or experience to handle such an unusual case. When Josiah came into the bedroom a few minutes later, Eleanor was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap and her expression serene. "I heard," she said quietly before he could speak. Josiah sat beside her, the bed creaking under his weight. "Eleanor, I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever we have to do, The most important thing is keeping you safe. The baby. His voice cracked with emotion. The baby is precious, but you're everything to me. If it comes down to a choice, it won't, Eleanor said firmly, turning to face him. I won't accept that it has to be a choice. This baby is part of both of us, part of our love, and I'm going to find a way to bring our child safely into this world. Eleanor, you heard what Doc Harrison said. The risks are just that, risks, not certainties. Eleanor reached for his hands, her small fingers threading through his massive ones. I need you to have faith, Josiah. Faith in me, faith in our baby, faith that love really can conquer anything. Josiah stared down at their joined hands, and Eleanor could see the fear and hope warring in his expression. I do have faith, he said finally, but I'm terrified of losing you. You won't lose me, Eleanor said with quiet conviction. We've come too far, overcome too much, built too much together for it to end now. This baby is going to be born healthy and strong, and we're going to raise them together in this house you built for us. 2 weeks later, on a cold morning in late November, Eleanor's labor began. It started gently with contractions that felt more like strong cramps than the overwhelming pain she'd been expecting. Dr. Harrison had taken up residence in their spare room, and Sarah Morrison had come to assist with the birth. Josiah paced the main room like a caged bear, his massive frame radiating anxiety and helpless frustration. First babies take their time, Sarah told Eleanor, as another contraction peaked and faded. Don't worry about the menfolk, they always carry on like the world's ending when there's a birthing happening. But as the hours passed, it became clear that this birth was different from anything Sarah had experienced. The contractions were strong but irregular, and despite Eleanor's best efforts, the baby showed no signs of moving into position for delivery. By evening, Dr. Harrison's expression had grown grim. The baby's too large, he told them bluntly, and positioned wrong. We need to make some decisions, and we need to make them soon. Eleanor, exhausted from hours of fruitless labor, looked up at him with determination that surprised everyone in the room. What kind of decisions? We can try to turn the baby manually. It's risky and painful, but it might work. Or, he paused clearly, reluctant to voice the alternative. Or we can prepare for surgical delivery. Here, Josiah asked, his voice hoarse with fear. In our bedroom. There's no time to get to a proper hospital, Dr. Harrison said. If we're going to do this, it has to be here now with what we have available. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her, as if their child was as eager to be born as she was to hold them. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze was steady and resolute. Try to turn the baby first, she said. And if that doesn't work, do the surgery. Eleanor, Josiah began, his voice raw with anguish. No, Eleanor said firmly. I've made my decision. This baby is going to be born tonight one way or another. What followed was the longest night of Eleanor's life. Dr. Harrison's attempts to manually turn the baby were agonizing and ultimately unsuccessful. By midnight, it was clear that surgery was their only option. Sarah Morrison proved to be worth her weight in gold, assisting Dr. Harrison with the kind of calm competence that came from years of frontier living. She boiled water, sterilized instruments, and prepared makeshift surgical equipment with the efficiency of a trained nurse. Josiah was banished to the main room where he sat with his head in his hands and prayed harder than he'd ever prayed in his life. Through the bedroom door, he could hear Eleanor's voice, weak but determined, asking Dr. Harrison to explain each step of the procedure. I want to know what's happening, she said. This is my baby, my body. I have a right to know. The surgery began just after midnight, with Sarah holding Eleanor's hand and Dr. Harrison working with the focused intensity of a man who understood that 3 lives hung in the balance. Eleanor, dosed with the strongest pain medication Dr. Harrison dared give her, drifted in and out of consciousness, her awareness reduced to fragments of sensation and sound. She heard Dr. Harrison's sharp intake of breath, heard Sarah's whispered prayer, felt the sudden absence of pressure as her child was lifted from her body. Then, after a moment that felt like eternity, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a baby's strong, healthy cry. "It's a boy," Dr. Harrison announced, his voice thick with relief and wonder. "A big, healthy boy." Eleanor tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. Is he all right? He's perfect," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Absolutely perfect." They placed the baby on Eleanor's chest, and she looked down at her son with wonder and overwhelming love. He was indeed large, probably close to 10 pounds, with a shock of dark hair like his father's, and the kind of robust cry that suggested strong lungs and a healthy constitution. "James," Eleanor whispered the name she and Josiah had chosen months ago. "His name is James." Josiah appeared in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes wild with fear and hope. When he saw Eleanor holding their son, alive and alert, despite everything they'd been through, he nearly collapsed with relief. "Eleanor," he said, his voice breaking. "Oh, my brave, wonderful Eleanor." Dr. Harrison was working to repair the surgical incision, his movements swift and sure despite the makeshift conditions. "She did beautifully," he told Josiah, "better than I dared hope. The bleeding is minimal, and if we can prevent infection, she should make a full recovery." Eleanor looked up at Josiah, seeing the love and awe and profound gratitude shining in his eyes. "We did it," she whispered. "We made a miracle." James chose that moment to let out another lusty cry, as if announcing his arrival to the world. Eleanor laughed through her tears, marveling at the perfect weight of him in her arms, at the way his tiny fist curled around her finger with surprising strength. "He's going to be tall like his papa," she said, noting the length of his legs and the breadth of his shoulders. "And stubborn like his mama," Josiah replied, settling carefully on the edge of the bed to get his first close look at his son. "Look at him, Eleanor. He's absolutely perfect." James seemed to recognize his father's voice, turning his head toward the sound and blinking up at them with dark eyes that would eventually settle into the same green as Josiah's. Eleanor watched her husband fall in love with their child. In real time, saw the moment when James became the center of Josiah's universe, just as surely as she was. The recovery was slow but steady. Eleanor remained bedridden for 2 weeks, during which time Josiah proved himself to be a surprisingly capable nursemaid. He changed diapers with the same careful precision he used for everything else, fed James bottles of milk when Eleanor was too tired to nurse, and paced the floor during those long nights when their son seemed determined to explore the full range of his vocal abilities. "He's going to be a singer," Eleanor joked one morning after a particularly noisy night. "Or maybe a politician." "He's going to be whatever he wants to be," Josiah replied, cradling James against his massive chest with infinite tenderness, "as long as he's happy and healthy." News of James's successful birth spread through Ember Ridge like wildfire, generating a mixture of celebration and amazement. The townspeople who'd predicted disaster were forced to eat their words, while those who'd supported Eleanor and Josiah from the beginning felt vindicated in their faith. Mrs. Pritchard, faced with the undeniable evidence of a healthy mother and baby, could only mutter about unnatural circumstances and divine intervention, though even she couldn't argue with the reality of James's robust health and Eleanor's remarkable recovery. When Eleanor was finally strong enough to venture outside, she and Josiah took James on his first tour of the ranch. Eleanor marveled at how right it felt to walk these familiar paths with their son in her arms to show him the land that would someday be his inheritance. "Look, James," she said, pointing toward the mountains that rose like purple sentinels in the distance. "That's your home. All of this will be yours someday." James gurgled and reached for a butterfly that danced just out of his grasp, his movements already showing the coordination and strength that suggested he'd inherited the best of both his parents. He would be tall like Josiah. Eleanor could already tell, but he had her delicate features and quick intelligence. "He's going to need brothers and sisters," Josiah set his arm around Eleanor's waist as they watched their son explore the world with his eyes. Eleanor looked up at him in surprise. "After everything we just went through, you want more children?" "Don't you?" Josiah asked. "This house feels meant for a big family, Eleanor. All that space we built, all those bedrooms waiting to be filled." Eleanor considered the question seriously. The birth had been difficult, dangerous, and more painful than anything she'd ever experienced. Harrison had warned them that future pregnancies would carry similar risks, that each child would likely be as challenging to deliver as James had been. But as she looked down at her son, at the perfect miracle they'd created together, Eleanor felt her heart expand with the possibility of more children who would fill their home with laughter and chaos and unconditional love. "Yes," she said finally, "I want more children, as many as God sees fit to bless us with." Josiah's smile was radiant, even knowing the risks, especially knowing the risks, Eleanor. Eleanor replied, "Some things are worth any risk, and our children are definitely among them." 2 years later, Eleanor was pregnant again, this time armed with the knowledge gained from James's birth. Dr. Harrison was better prepared. The surgery was planned in advance, the equipment properly sterilized, and Sarah Morrison was officially trained as his assistant. Their daughter Mary was born on a spring morning when the prairie was alive with new grass and the promise of abundant wildflowers. She was smaller than James had been, but still large by most standards, with Eleanor's brown eyes and Josiah's stubborn chin. The third child, another son they named Thomas, arrived with less drama than his siblings, as if he understood that he needed to be considerate of his mother's increasingly fragile condition. By the time little Sarah was born 2 years later, Eleanor had become something of a local legend, the tiny woman who defied all expectations to become the mother of 4 healthy, thriving children. The additions to the house had been expanded twice more to accommodate their growing family. What had started as a simple ranch house had become a sprawling homestead, with bedrooms for each child, a kitchen large enough to feed a small army, and a dining room where the entire family could gather for meals and conversation. Eleanor loved the controlled chaos of their daily life, the sound of children's laughter echoing through the halls, the constant activity of a house full of growing youngsters, the way Josiah could manage all 4 children at once, with the same gentle competence he brought to everything else. "How did we get so lucky?" she asked him one evening as they sat on the front porch watching their children play in the yard. James, now 6, was teaching 3-year-old Mary how to rope a fence post, while Thomas toddled around the garden under the watchful eye of 2-year-old Sarah. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Josiah replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "This is what happens when 2 people are brave enough to believe in something everyone else thinks is impossible." Eleanor leaned into his warmth, marveling at how completely her life had transformed since that terrifying day when she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Ember Ridge. She'd been running from one impossible situation, never dreaming that she was running toward something even more impossible and infinitely more wonderful. The children they'd created were proof that love really could conquer any obstacle. James had inherited his father's size and strength, but his mother's quick wit and gentle nature. Mary was small like Eleanor, but fearless like Josiah, already showing signs of the determination that ran in both sides of the family. Thomas was the peacemaker, quiet and thoughtful, with an artist's eye for beauty and detail. And little Sarah was pure sunshine, lighting up every room she entered with her infectious laughter and boundless energy. "They're all so different," Eleanor observed, watching Mary successfully rope the fence post, while James cheered her on. "But they all fit together perfectly. Like their parents," Josiah said softly. "Different sizes, different backgrounds, different everything. But somehow when you put them all together, they make a perfect family." Eleanor smiled, remembering the words she'd spoken to Mrs. Pritchard all those years ago, that love didn't measure itself in inches or pounds. Looking at her children now, she could see the truth of that statement in living color. They ranged in size from Sarah's tiny frame to James's already impressive height, but they loved each other fiercely and unconditionally. As the sun began to set over the prairie painting, the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the children reluctantly came inside for their evening meal. The dining room filled with the cheerful chaos of a large family, requests for seconds, disputes over who got the last biscuit, stories about the day's adventures and plans for tomorrow's activities. Eleanor watched it all from her place at the foot of the table, Josiah at the head, like a benevolent giant presiding over his kingdom. This was what she'd dreamed of during those lonely nights in Boston, though she'd never dared imagine it could be quite this wonderful. After the children were tucked into their beds, Eleanor and Josiah returned to the front porch for their nightly ritual of watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. The silence was comfortable, filled with the satisfaction of a day well lived and the promise of many more to come. "Do you ever regret it?" Josiah asked quietly. Answering that advertisement coming all the way out here to marry a stranger, Eleanor turned to look at him, this gentle giant who'd given her everything she'd never known she wanted. "Never," she said firmly. "This life, these children, this love we've built together, it's worth every risk we took to get here. Even the gossip, even Mrs. Pritchard and all her friends who still think we're some kind of circus act." Eleanor laughed, remembering the way the older woman had grudgingly congratulated them on Sarah's birth, unable to deny the evidence of their happiness any longer. Especially the gossip. They said we'd never make it work, that we were too different, that love couldn't bridge the gap between us. And look what we've built together. She gestured toward the house behind them, where 4 beautiful children slept safely in their beds, toward the ranch that stretched out under the starlight, toward the life they'd created from nothing but hope and determination and an unshakable faith in each other. "We proved them all wrong," she continued. "We proved that the most impossible love stories are sometimes the most true." Josiah pulled her closer, and Eleanor marveled, as always, at how perfectly she fit against his side, how her head rested just right on his shoulder, how their bodies had learned to accommodate each other's differences. "I love you, Eleanor McCready," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I loved you when you were just a tiny woman stepping off a dusty stagecoach, and I love you even more now that you're the mother of my children and the heart of my home." "I love you too," Eleanor replied, the words carrying the weight of 7 years of marriage, 4 children, countless challenges overcome, and a love that had only grown stronger with time. However big or small we are, we fit perfectly together. As the stars wheeled overhead and the prairie wind whispered through the grass, Eleanor and Josiah sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the life they'd built from an impossible dream. Their love story had defied every expectation, challenged every assumption, and proved that sometimes the greatest miracles came from the most unlikely pairings. In the morning, there would be children to feed and lessons to teach and a ranch to run. There would be new challenges to face and new adventures to embrace. But tonight, there was only this, the peace that came from knowing they'd found their place in the world, the satisfaction of a love that had triumphed over every obstacle, and the quiet certainty that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Just as they always had and just as they always would. Their family had become a symbol in Ember Ridge of what was possible when love refused to accept limitations, when 2 people dared to believe that different could be beautiful, when the heart chose to see possibility where others saw only problems. And as Eleanor drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the impossible love that had given her everything she'd never dared dream of, and for the children who would carry that love forward into a future bright with infinite possibility. Their story had become legend, but it was also proof, living, breathing proof, that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones the world swore could never be written.